and against the Argentinian generals. This kind of Judaism puts humanity at the first place and not a narrow-minded perception. And I think that in many ways it is a distortion to call Israel a Jewish state. For me, Israel is not a non-Jewish state. It's a Zionist state, which is something very different, which is much more akin to apartheid. Is that if you would call apartheid a Christian state, and it would be wrong to call apartheid a Christian state, because Christianity has so many manifestations, or to call any oppressive state that uses Islam to oppress people an Islamic state. The monotheistic religions are much wider, much more inclusive, much richer than being reduced into the narrow idea of nationalism or ethnicity. We deserve much more as people who are inspired by our religious heritage, by our commitment, than to reduce or translate our religious faith into an ideology that justifies oppression, colonization, and dispossession. And Judaism does not have to be that kind of religion, nor was it until the appearance of Zionism.
We thank you, Professor, for giving us an insight, I think a very personal insight. When we get back, we'll look at some of the pressing questions. We're looking at history. You are a historian, an activist historian, so we want to look at the history and what has brought us to this point, and of course the current conflict. So, and I will invite our audience to prepare the questions. I already have one question for you, Professor, so I'll put that to you later, and then the Facebook address and Twitter handles will appear on screen. So do send us your questions, and we invite the audience to participate.
Thank you.
And welcome back to our discussion. We are in discussion with Professor Ilan Pappe, an Israeli historian, world-renowned, and one who has been described as a traitor in Israel, but seen by many as a brave activist historian. We want to look at background first, Professor, and I know people are eager to learn your perspective and your analysis of what's happening currently. But I think I want to start off with a very fundamental question, which in fact has come from the audience, and something that you referred to when you said that Israel cannot be described as a Jewish state, but it is a Zionist state. Give us a brief background about Zionism, its origins, and how has it really developed into what it is now?
Right. I think Zionism started out of two noble impulses, one should say, in Central and Eastern Europe. Jews felt unsafe in the mid-19th century and in the end of the 19th century for good reasons, as we know. And were looking for safer places to settle in because they did not feel secure in their own home countries. So that was one impulse that created the idea of looking for a different homeland from the one that they had. The second impulse was to redefine Judaism as a national movement because so many other ethnic and religious groups in Europe in the mid-19th century and later on defined themselves in terms of this new ideology of nationalism. The problem with Zionism began when it chose, after debating several other locations in the world, it chose Palestine as the space in which to implement these two impulses, namely to create a safer place and to reinvent themselves as a national movement. Something, by the way, that most of the Jews in the world rejected, but something which evangelical leaders of the churches, leaders of the evangelical churches, especially in Britain, endorsed for their own reasons. They saw the return of the Jews to Palestine as precipitating the second coming of the Messiah and part of a divine scheme. And in fact, they exerted strong pressure on the Zionist movement not to look for other locations. For their own religious reasons, they wanted the Jews to go to Palestine. So the moment Zionism was connected so strongly to imperial British interests on the one hand, and chose a land which was already inhabited by another people, it turned from an ideology of salvage into an ideology of colonization. And from that moment onwards, the preoccupation of the Zionist movement was not with saving Jews, as was clearly shown in the very meager efforts they have done to save Jews during the Second World War, during the Nazi Holocaust. Their main preoccupation was with the native indigenous people of Palestine. So if you are an ideological movement which is all the time disturbed by the presence of the indigenous people, you become an ideology that may have great achievements in many other aspects of life, and Zionism did have major achievements in other aspects of life, but it all depends on your ability to get rid, frankly, of the indigenous people of Palestine. So Zionism, for me, from the 1930s onwards, and especially today, is an ideology which is focused on creating a supremacist, exclusive Jewish society all over historical Palestine.
Just looking at the term Zionist, I find it very interesting the times when you refer, if one is a critic and you say, the Zionist project, for example, it's almost seen by the Zionists as an offensive term. Can you just speak that?
Yes, that's an interesting paradox. When Zionists talk about Zionism, it's a noble, positive ideology. If I will talk about the Zionists as being Zionist, they would say, you're a self-hating Jew. It's very interesting. It's one of the indicators of the paradoxes Israeli Jews live in. They know that in their internal conversation, they use terminology which would be condemned outside of Israel as unacceptable on moral grounds. For instance, they talk about colonization as a religious imperative, as a national interest, but they understand that you cannot present it as such to the world. So you don't talk about colonization, you talk about settlement or habitation or construction projects. Israel has the biggest laundrette of words that the world has ever seen. And it's overworked, and it stopped working a long time ago, to my mind. Assassinations are targeted killings. Occupation is an enlightened takeover. A killing of people is purity of arms, and so on. This tension between your own perceptions of what you are doing and the knowledge that the world will not justify this kind of behavior is part of the attempt to brand Israel as something it is not. And this is why you can have this dichotomy that you're talking about, that if you and I talk about Zionism, it means that we are almost anti-Semitic. In my case, maybe even in your case, Ivona, we're totally right. But we will be condemned as such. But the Zionist representatives in South Africa, when they talk about Zionism, that's okay, that's kosher. I think that this is something that has to be further exposed. I think language is very, very important because it covers crimes. Language covers crimes. And even the most feeble resistance, even the most disadvantaged, oppressed people can use language. You can take from them the land, their houses, the power to resist, but you cannot take the language from them. And I think that's why we should insist of a different kind, a cleaner language that would call a spade and would face the people in Israel with the reality that they are creating in the eyes of the world.
That brings me to a question from one of our viewers, Dr. Isi Hassim. He writes to us from Lodium in Pretoria. And he talks about the coverage by the mainstream media of events in the Middle East and particularly Palestine. And he says that he's frustrated that there is no full exposure and examination of the Israeli-Zionist conflict and the problem created by the subtle pressure on Western editors. He's talking about perhaps the laundering of words has worked on the Western media, or is there some other influence?
I think he's right, and I think that is even more than just the issue of laundering of words. There's a certain consensus among senior Western journalists and senior Western academics that you are only allowed to condemn and criticize Israeli policies but not ideologies. This would be akin to criticism of certain policies of apartheid South Africa with a consensus not to criticize apartheid itself. And one has to ask oneself, how was this consensus formed, which is the main answer to the question, why is the Western media doing what it is doing? In a recent book of mine that came out in February, The Idea of Israel, I was trying, I think I was the first one who ever tried that. I was trying to answer that question. So first of all, I urge your the person who asked the question to buy the book. And he shouldn't worry, this is not a promotion. You don't get much out of academic books, so he's not going to enrich me financially, only would reward me in other ways by reading the book. I came to the conclusion that somehow the Israeli academics and media people succeeded for a very long time, probably not anymore, but until recently, in convincing that people who are central in the media or in the academia or in the cultural production, that Israel is really an exclusive case in the world, that it is a project of modernity, of enlightenment and progress that succeeded outside of Europe and the United States, to such a degree that if it's not going to be protected, a different kind of civilization will take over. And therefore, even if you have severe criticism or very tough questions to ask, you have to be very careful with your criticism. I don't even think it's intimidation or this theory that people have of Jewish money or lobbying or intimidation. Maybe it's also there, but I think the main hurdle for an honest coverage of the Middle East is the self-censorship that Western media is employing. They're not employing this censorship because they're afraid of someone. As I say, in some cases it may be true. But in most cases, they have really bought in to a brand, into a narrative. And the reason they have bought into a narrative is that a very powerful coalition of scholars, on the one hand, and filmmakers, on the other hand, produced this idea that it's a valid narrative scientifically. And the cinema helped to disseminate these images that the narrative brings with it through the power of Hollywood to so many people. So I think that you have a real problem in deconstructing for these media people the reality in Israel and Palestine. The only question we have to ask is why today, when there's so much information, this is still going on. And I think that inertia is also part of human nature. If you have been doing something for 40 years, even if you have ample information to tell you that what you are doing is wrong, it's very, very difficult to change your mind. But we should be hopeful about, because there are early signs that some journalists, even in the New York Times, beginning to see the light and the truth.
Before we turn to the audience to pick up a question, this is also a question from the audience, a written question. And I think it looks at a bit of the history and also touches on some of your writings, Professor. It says, since Zionism and the State of Israel were founded and established on the grounds of ethnic cleansing and terrorizing the indigenous population, now post 9/11 and the current trend of international Islamophobia, the Palestinians are being referred to as the terrorists. Your comments, please.
Well, I think the first comment is that the Palestinian national struggle took all kinds of forms since its inception as an anti-colonialist movement. It was first led by Christians. Then it subscribed to very secular ideologies. And when these secular ideologies failed to deliver, people put their faith in Islam. But it didn't matter whether Palestinians were seeking justice in the name of humanity, religion, or socialism, or even at some stages communism, they were always regarded as terrorists. The very idea that you, as a Palestinian, questions the right of the Jews to have a supremacist, exclusive state in Palestine is an act of terrorism. And it became worse, I think, with the years, because the Orientalists, those who are the experts on the Arab world and mind in Israeli academia, added another layer to this analysis. They said that actually Arab culture is such that Palestinians would never change their attitude, and the reason they resist Zionism is not because of what the Zionist movement is doing to them, but because of who they are. Which means that the moment you are born as a Palestinian, you are already potentially a terrorist. And this explains the fact that is still difficult to explain, but has to be understood, why so many Israeli Jews don't shed one tear when they see the fractured skulls of babies in Gaza. Because even a Palestinian baby, for them, is a potential terrorist. This dehumanization goes so deeply that it's impossible to impress upon them the humanity that suffers from their policies. And as I said before, struggling against dehumanization is not a project for 1 day or 2 days. And I'm sure you in South Africa know it better than I do. How long does it take to deprogram a mind that does not view the other as a human being, or views the other as an inferior human being? And the branding of the Palestinians as terrorists has nothing to do with the Palestinian actions. It has to do with their unfortunate location in the space coveted by the Zionist movement as a space for survival and thriving. And they are looked as the worst hurdle or the most formidable hurdle for both existence and progressing and thriving.
We'll take a question from the audience, and I think we have
The name is Liaquat. What I would like to know is, what is the total population of the Jews in Israel, and what percentage is the Zionist? And also, outside Israel, what is the same percentage of Jews as well as the Zionists? And is there any attempt by the Jews to overthrow the Zionists at any stage, because it affects them also during this period of time?
Thank you. I have a problem in answering some of these questions because since the age of Wikipedia, I don't try to remember anymore the numbers of Jews in Israel, or for that matter, the number of Jews in the United States. So do check my figures afterwards. I do beseech you. I think there are today about 6.5 million Jews in Israel. But again, do check it. And I think there is an equal number of Jews around the world. Your second part of the question is easier to answer because it is not statistics, which I don't try to remember anymore in my advanced age. So it's a very difficult question to answer only in the sense that this is a dynamic situation. As we speak, Jews are distancing themselves from Zionism. You are talking about a process which is happening as we speak. So it would be unwise of me to try and assess how significant it is before we can see its progress. But one thing is very clear. One thing is very clear. The young Jewish generation around the world, in greater numbers than ever before, disassociates itself from Zionism. They don't want to be associated with Israel or what Israel is doing. It doesn't mean necessarily that they will put themselves at the forefront of the struggle against Zionism, but they definitely do not want to serve as ambassadors or ambassadress for Zionism. And that's a very important fact that even Israel recognizes. One of the implications of this recognition is a very honest statement by Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who said that Israeli policy in the United States relies now much more on Christian Zionists than on the Jewish public. He said, we cannot trust the Jewish community as we could in the past. The Christian Zionist community is far more trustworthy as a pillar of support for the state of Israel. And that gives you an indication that the Jewish communities around the world will not be in the future the foundation on which Israel would be able to base its international support. Thank you.
Just picking up on that question, is the question, okay, I'll take one question from the audience before we go for the break. We've got 3 minutes, so please keep your questions brief, and I'll ask Professor to respond.
Thank you very much. Mine's going to be very brief. Thank you. You spoke about Christian support for the state of Israel. But I'm very interested in Muslim complicity of the Arab states, the Saudis. Just today, I think the New York Times was boasting that Egypt and Saudi Arabia particularly, and the other monarchies, have deserted Palestine. They're absolutely alone. We watch this carnage and we wonder what's going to happen tomorrow. That would be a huge hindering factor. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is that the Israeli argument, the Zionist argument recently, is more about we've built an oasis in the desert, we've produced so many Nobel laureates, what have the Muslims done? Now, to what extent can we argue back and say it's a human rights issue? It's not about your success in this material world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor, if I can, sorry to interrupt your response, but it's a kind of multi-layered question, so I suppose you would appreciate the ad break to think about it, and when we come back, Professor will respond to your question. And can I just ask you if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself when you pose the question? That was Professor Anwar Mala. We'll come back, we'll give you your response, Professor rather will give you a response immediately after the break.
Thank you.
And welcome back to our discussion with Professor Ilan Pappe, a noted historian and activist from Israel, but now lecturing in the United Kingdom. I just want to remind viewers who may have tuned in just after our introduction that this was meant to be a debate. We invited the pro-Israel lobby spokesperson, the South African Board of Jewish Deputies, as well as the South African Zionist Federation. And in fact, until about 2 hours before the program, we contacted the South African Union of Jewish Students. And before I ask you to respond to Professor Anwar Mal's question, there is another question that's linked to that. But can you just respond to the non-appearance of of invited guests?
Yes, I have to stress that I was very willing, without any conditions, without any strings attached, to debate whoever was willing to debate me. But I must say it's a global phenomenon. And I think that I know the reason now, because I once debated, which probably was the last time anyone from Israel debated me outside of Israel. I once debated the Israeli consul in New York, and he said to the audience that I'm a dangerous people because I believe Israel should be a democracy. It's very difficult to construct a response to this that makes sense to people who are not Zionists. So I think it's very difficult to win the argument if you come with an agenda which is not violent, is democratic, is pluralistic, is inclusive. In the 21st century, countering this agenda with talk about exclusivity, supremacy, exclusion, and colonization in an open debate is not a very easy task. It's much easier to do it in Israel, where I stopped being interviewed because it looks more like a field marshal, a field court, than an interview. So I'm very sorry about it, because I think these issues have to be debated. I take very seriously the Israeli counter-arguments. I don't brush them aside as stupid or unacceptable. I want to engage with them. It says something about these arguments when they are not being freely displayed or not willingly displayed in a free space and environment.
Perhaps later in the program, I would act as your interlocutor, so that may still come up, the Israeli viewpoint. Just by, not my viewpoint, but certainly just express that what one reads and the kind of narrative that comes through the mainstream media. On to Professor Anwar Mal, I beg your pardon, Professor Anwar Mal's question. There's one, I think I would just add this, it comes via Twitter from Ahmed Ismail, and he, in similar veins, asks, why are the Arab states so quiet on the issue? When are they going to stand up against Zionism? And of course, Professor Anwar Mal talking about the complicity of the states around Israel.
Yeah. I think that, of course, this is a question the people in those countries should ask themselves. I should not be their guide or a prophet on this. As an historian, I'm very much aware of this complicity and silence. But I think it's part of the overall problem of the Arab regimes. It's only reflected in the case of Palestine in a lack of solidarity from the governments themselves. I think that, like in Europe, also in the Arab world, the more democratic the regimes are, the more likely the governments are going to take a moral and courageous stance on Palestine. It doesn't matter whether you live in Saudi Arabia or in Denmark. The issue of Palestine is one that is very clearly delineated between conscientious people and indifferent people. And most of the people, I don't think, are indifferent. So democratization in the Arab world would lead naturally to a very different stance. One can only add to this that it served certain Arab regimes either to be silent on the issue of Palestine, especially if they wanted to be within the American sphere of influence, or it served them equally well to use Palestine as a pretext not to deal with their own social and economic problems. But I really think that the Arab world is now an area of change, of transition. And transition sometimes is manifested in more bloody phases. Sometimes it's manifested in more quiet revolutions. But I have no doubt that eventually this process that in fact dismantles the colonialist structure that was built in the Middle East after the First World War will include Israel and Palestine.